The engine coughed twice, shuddered, then died with a metallic grinding that echoed across the empty scrubland. I let the steering wheel slip through my calloused hands as the ute rolled to a stop, red dust settling around me. The silence that followed was absolute. No bird calls, no insect buzz, just the tick of cooling metal and my own breathing. I tried the ignition. Nothing. The starter motor was dead, and from the smell of burning oil, something fundamental had given up deep in the engine bay. I climbed out and popped the hood, already knowing what I'd find. Oil everywhere, a cracked engine block visible even to my untrained eye, and metal shavings glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. "Bloody hell," I muttered, pushing my hat back. The Toyota had been reliable for 15 years, but everything had its breaking point. Mine did too, apparently. I'd changed my usual route to the Kalgoorlie supply depot at the last minute, taking what looked like a shortcut on the GPS. Now I was 60 kilometers from the nearest marked track, surrounded by mallee scrub and spinifex that stretched to every horizon. I pulled my phone from my shirt pocket. No signal, not even a single bar. I held it high, walked in circles, climbed onto the ute's roof. Nothing. The emergency beacon was back at the station. I'd meant to throw it in the cab but had forgotten in my hurry to beat the weather forecast. Another brilliant decision. I jumped down and surveyed my situation with the methodical calm that 20 years of station work had taught me. Water. 2 bottles in the cab, maybe 3 liters total. Food. A packet of biscuits, some beef jerky, and half a thermos of lukewarm tea. Shelter. The ute itself, and a thin sleeping bag I'd brought for the overnight trip. Tools. Basic kit, nothing fancy. Clothing. Work clothes, hat, boots. The temperature was already touching 35 degrees, and autumn in the WA interior could still kill you if you weren't careful. The smart play was to wait. Someone would notice I was overdue. Probably my wife Sarah by tomorrow night when I didn't call. The station manager would raise the alarm by day 3 at the latest. Search aircraft would follow my planned route first, then expand outward. Problem was, I wasn't on my planned route. Nobody knew about my shortcut because I decided on it after leaving that morning. I walked a slow circle around the ute, thinking. Walking out was possible. 60 kilometers wasn't impossible for a fit man with water, but 60 kilometers in which direction? My GPS showed my location as a dot in an ocean of beige, with the nearest town 120 kilometers northeast. The track I'd left was closer, but in this heat, with minimal water, walking was a death sentence if I guessed wrong. No. Wait first. Be smart about it. I set up camp in the ute's shadow, using the vehicle as a windbreak. The afternoon stretched on, heat shimmering off the red dirt, occasional dust devils spinning across the plains. By evening, the temperature dropped enough for comfort, and I allowed myself a careful sip of water and a few biscuits. The stars came out in a display that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The second day brought flies, and the first real taste of worry. They arrived with the sunrise, a persistent cloud that found every exposed patch of skin. I rationed myself to 3 small sips of water, holding each one in my mouth before swallowing, trying to make the moisture last. The beef jerky required careful chewing. The salt made my tongue burn and increased my thirst, but I needed the protein. I spent the morning walking in expanding circles around the ute, marking my path with torn strips of shirt tied to bushes. Looking for anything useful. A dam, a bore, old fence lines that might lead somewhere. Nothing but endless scrub and the distant smudge of low hills. By the 3rd day, with my lips already cracking and my mouth sticky with thirst, I forced myself to think beyond waiting. My tongue felt swollen, and when I ran it across my lips I could taste blood where the sun had split the skin. I needed water, and water meant getting clever. I remembered enough from my army days to know that morning dew could be collected, that certain plants held moisture. At dawn, I stripped off my shirt and used it to mop dew from the ute's surface, working methodically across the hood and roof. Each section yielded only drops, but I wrung them carefully into my mouth. The metallic taste of condensation mixed with dust and rust was the sweetest thing I'd ever experienced. The jerky was gone by day 4. I ate the last strip slowly, chewing until it was paste, extracting every bit of flavor and nutrition. The biscuits lasted until day 5, growing softer in the heat until they crumbled at my touch. I chewed spinifex stems for the moisture, the sharp grass cutting my gums and leaving a bitter aftertaste. Some small berries on a bush I couldn't identify caught my eye, purple-black and plump with juice. I ate them anyway, figuring starvation was a more immediate threat than poisoning. My stomach cramped for hours afterward, waves of nausea that left me doubled over beside the ute. But I kept them down, and the moisture they provided felt like salvation. On day 6, I heard an aircraft. The distant drone sent me scrambling to the ute's roof, my movements clumsy with weakness. I waved my shirt and shouted until my voice cracked, the sound barely more than a whisper in the vast silence. The plane passed 2 kilometers to the north, never varying course, its engine note steady and indifferent. They weren't looking for me. Not here. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag staring at stars that pulsed with each beat of my dehydration headache, I accepted the truth I'd been avoiding. Nobody was coming. My route change hadn't been logged anywhere, hadn't been mentioned to anyone. Sarah would be frantic by now, probably calling everyone we knew, but the search teams would be looking in all the wrong places. The desert stretched around me like an ocean, and I was a man overboard with no one knowing where I'd fallen. I had 2 choices, die here beside the ute or walk out, and walking out meant finding water first. I woke on day 7 with a clarity born of necessity. The morning dew routine had become automatic, shirt off, systematic wiping, precious drops collected on my tongue. But I needed more than tablespoons of moisture scraped from metal. I needed a real water source, which meant exploration. Smart exploration, short trips, marked routes, always returning to base camp. I tore strips from my spare shirt and tied them to bushes, creating a trail system that would guide me back, even if my judgment became impaired. The fabric was already stained with sweat and dirt, but the bright blue stood out against the muted colors of the scrub. The first expedition took me east, following what might have been an old pad road, worn down by cattle or mining vehicles. My legs felt unsteady after days of minimal movement, and I had to stop frequently to rest, in whatever shade I could find. After 2 hours of walking, I found only more scrub and a rusted fence post with no fence attached. The post was pitted with age, its galvanized coating long since worn away, but its presence meant human activity at some point. People meant water, eventually. The second day of searching, I went south. Here the country changed subtly, the scrub giving way to patches of cleaner ground where water might collect after rains. The soil was different too, darker, with traces of organic matter that suggested more regular moisture. I found the bones of a kangaroo, picked clean and bleached white by sun and weather. The skull was intact, the empty eye sockets staring up at me like an omen. But I took it as a hopeful sign. Animals meant water, even if seasonal. Everything in this country was about seasons, about timing, about being in the right place when the rains came. On the 3rd day, walking north toward the low hills I'd been eyeing since the breakdown, I smelled it before I saw it. The green scent of growing things, moisture in the air that made my nostrils flare. My pace quickened despite my weakness, hope giving strength to legs that had barely carried me this far. I pushed through a thicker patch of mallee, branches catching at my clothes and scratching exposed skin. Then I found myself looking down into a shallow depression where water still stood in pools connected by the faintest trickle. A creek. Seasonal, barely more than a series of puddles now, but actual flowing water. I half slid down the bank, my boots finding purchase on rocks slick with algae. At the largest pool, I knelt and looked at my reflection in the brown water. I looked like hell, sunburned, stubbled, my eyes already taking on the hollow look of a man running on reserves. But I was alive, and there was water. The water tasted of mud and vegetation, but it was water. I drank carefully, remembering that too much too fast could make me sick. Small sips at first, letting my mouth adjust to the taste, feeling the moisture soak into tissue that had been desert dry for days. Then longer drinks, my body crying out for more even as my mind imposed discipline. I filled both my bottles, watching sediment swirl in the containers, then sat back to really look at the creek line. That's when I saw the yards. They were maybe 200 meters downstream, almost hidden by regrowth. Old cattle yards built from bush timber and rusted wire, the kind of infrastructure that spoke of serious investment in moving stock. The posts were still solid, hewn from some hardwood that had resisted decades of weather. The wire sagged and the gates hung crooked, but the basic structure remained sound. Someone had worked cattle here, probably during better seasons when the creek ran stronger. I walked through the yards noting the construction. Good work, built to last by people who understood the country. The rails were mortised and tenoned, joints tight enough that the structures had held despite years of neglect. A loading ramp led to what had probably been a trucking point, though any road was long gone. Grass and small shrubs had reclaimed the cleared areas, but the geometric lines of human planning were still visible to anyone who knew how to look. There were other signs of human presence: a concrete water trough, cracked but still holding shape, and a shed reduced to 3 walls and scattered iron roofing. The roofing sheets had been good quality once, heavy-gauge steel that had taken years of weather to punch through. I was examining the shed's remains when I found the first real sign that I wasn't the first person to shelter here recently: a circle of stones that had contained a fire, with ash still soft enough to crumble between my fingers. Fairly recent, maybe a few weeks old. The stones were blackened with repeated use, arranged in a careful pattern that spoke of someone who planned to stay a while. Beside it, a flattened area where someone had laid out a swag or sleeping bag. The grass was still pressed down, and when I knelt to examine it, I could smell the faint trace of human occupation. My skin prickled despite the afternoon heat. Someone else was living rough out here, or had been recently. The thought should have been comforting. Another person meant knowledge, possibly help, maybe even a way out of this empty country. Instead, it worried me. People didn't usually camp in abandoned cattle yards unless they had reasons to stay hidden. And people who stayed hidden in places like this often had reasons that weren't friendly to strangers. I searched more carefully and found other signs. A tin can opened with a knife, not a can opener, and buried in a shallow scrape behind the shed. The metal was still bright where it had been cut, protected from rust by the burial. Someone had taken care to hide their rubbish, which suggested either environmental consciousness or paranoia. Footprints in a patch of soft earth near the water, the tread worn smooth but the impressions clear. Boot size maybe 10 or 11, bigger than my 9s. The depth of the prints suggested someone heavier than me, or carrying a pack. And something else that made my skin crawl: scratches in the dirt that looked almost like tally marks, as if someone had been counting days, or counting something else. They were scratched into a patch of bare earth beside the fire circle, dozens of them in rough groups of 5, too many to be counting days unless someone had been here for months. What else would you count in a place like this? Animals seen? People past? Days since? What? I filled my bottles again and started the walk back to my ute, following my marker trail as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The strips of blue fabric stood out like beacons in the fading light, each one a small victory of planning over panic. I had water now, which changed everything. I could survive longer, think more clearly, plan properly. The cattle yards might even provide better shelter than sleeping beside my broken vehicle. But the signs of recent habitation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. In my experience, people who camped alone in the middle of nowhere usually had good reasons for avoiding civilization. And those reasons weren't always the kind you wanted to meet face to face, especially when you were already in a vulnerable position. Still, water was life. Whatever else might be lurking in this empty country, I now had the most essential element of survival. As I walked through the gathering dusk, following my improvised trail markers back to the ute, I tried to focus on that positive. Water, shelter, and now a base of operations from which to plan my next move. I tried not to think about those tally marks scratched in the dirt, or wonder what exactly they might have been counting. But the questions followed me through the cooling air, as persistent as the first mosquitoes emerging from the creek pools. I had been living on borrowed time for 12 days when the storm rolled in from the northwest, like a wall of red dust and black clouds. The morning had started calm, almost peaceful, with me working on a fishing line snare constructed from wire salvaged from the old yards. I'd moved my base camp here after finding the water source, sleeping in what remained of the old shed, and using the stone fireplace left by the previous occupant. The routine had given me hope. Water runs at dawn and dusk, exploring during the cooler parts of the day, maintaining my gear and rationing what remained of my food supplies. The first warning came as a stillness that felt wrong. The constant background noise of insects and small birds faded to nothing, as if someone had thrown a switch. Even the flies that had become my constant companions seemed to disappear. The air grew heavy with an electric tension that made my skin prickle and the hair on my arms stand up. I looked up from the snare I'd been constructing to see the sky turning an ominous yellow-brown in the distance. I'd lived in Western Australia long enough to recognize the signs. The color was wrong. Not the blue-gray of normal storm clouds, but the sickly yellow that meant dust and wind and serious weather. This wasn't just a storm. It was going to be a weather bomb that would turn the landscape inside out. The kind of system that moved cattle around like toys and turned roads into rivers. I worked frantically to secure what little I had. My water containers went into the most sheltered corner of the shed, wedged behind a pile of old timber that looked solid enough to withstand wind. I wrapped them individually in the remains of my spare shirt, trying to protect them from flying debris. My remaining food, 2 tins of beans I'd found cached in the shed, some crackers going soft in the heat, and a precious handful of dried fruit, got wrapped in my spare clothing and shoved into my pack. The tarp I'd salvaged from my ute became a makeshift windbreak, tied between 2 remaining wall posts with knots that would have made my old sailing instructor proud. The wind hit first, a howling beast that came out of nowhere and bent the scrub trees horizontal. It started as gusts that made the corrugated iron roof sheets above me groan and flex. Then it became constant, a steady roar that made thinking difficult and communication impossible. Debris began flying, small branches at first, then larger pieces of wood, sheets of bark torn from trees, even stones picked up and flung like bullets. I huddled in my inadequate shelter as the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Then came the rain, not falling, but driving sideways in sheets that found every gap in my defenses. The drops hit like pellets, stinging, exposed skin, and soaking through clothes in seconds. Within minutes, I was drenched and shivering, my body heat leached away by wind and water. The shed that had seemed like adequate shelter became a trap, its remaining walls channeling the wind into vicious eddies that seemed to come from every direction at once. The shed held for the first hour. I crouched in the corner, listening to the corrugated iron roof sheets I'd tried to secure groaning and flexing above me. They were held down with rocks and twisted wire, but the wind found every weak point. One by one, they began to tear free. The first sheet went with a screech of metal that cut through even the wind's roar. I watched it tumble away into the darkness, a ghostly shape that disappeared into the storm like it had never existed. The second sheet followed minutes later, and suddenly I was exposed to the full fury of the storm. Rain lashed down with tropical intensity, each drop hitting with enough force to sting. My tarp lasted another 20 minutes before a gust caught it like a sail and ripped it from my hands. I watched my only real shelter disappear into the storm, a blue shape tumbling end over end, until the rain swallowed it completely. The night became a battle for survival, measured in minutes. I pressed myself against the remaining wall as debris flew past. Branches, more roofing iron, even what looked like part of a fence post spinning through the air like a spear. The rain was so heavy I could barely breathe, each breath feeling like drowning. Water ran off the wall in sheets, pooling around my boots and turning the ground to mud. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, close enough to leave me deaf and seeing spots. When the lightning struck close by, illuminating the yards in stark black and white, I saw my water containers scattered across the open ground. One was already empty and rolling in the wind like a tumbleweed. Another had cracked against a fence post, its precious contents mixing with the storm water. I made a desperate dash to rescue what I could, fighting against wind that threatened to knock me flat. The mud sucked at my boots with each step, and flying debris forced me to keep my head down and arms raised for protection. I managed to grab 2 containers before another lightning strike, close enough to make my fillings ache, drove me back to my pathetic shelter. The thunder that followed was instantaneous, a physical blow that left my ears ringing. I clutched the rescued water containers and tried not to think about what I'd lost. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a transformed landscape. I emerged from my sodden hiding place to survey the damage and felt my heart sink. The cattle yards looked like a bomb had gone off. Every piece of loose material had been scattered or destroyed. Fence rails twisted into impossible shapes, wire tangled around posts like giant spider webs. My carefully organized camp was gone, spread across square kilometers of scrubland. The creek had become a muddy torrent, running bank to bank with water the color of chocolate. Any thought of drinking from it would have to wait hours for the sediment to settle. Worse, my water situation had become critical again. Of the 6 containers I'd filled over the past few days, only one remained full. Another held perhaps a liter, contaminated with dirt and debris that had blown in during the storm. The rest were empty, cracked, or simply gone. I spent the morning in a widening search pattern, looking for my scattered gear. The mud sucked at my boots with each step, and the transformed landscape made navigation difficult. Landmarks I'd learned to rely on had been altered or destroyed. Trees that had provided reference points were stripped bare or knocked down entirely. I found 1 tin of beans 50 meters away, dented but intact, half buried in mud. My spare boots were wedged in a tree, one sole split beyond repair from impact, with something hard. The fishing line had vanished completely, along with most of my improvised tools. The psychological impact was almost worse than the material losses. After days of careful planning and rationing, of building routines that gave structure to my isolation, I felt like I was starting over from nothing. Worse than nothing, I was weaker now, my body eating itself as my food supplies dwindled. The progress I'd made, the small victories that had kept despair at bay, had been erased in a single night. The creek still ran, but the storm had churned it into a muddy flow that would need hours to settle before it was safe to drink. Brown water swirled past, carrying debris from upstream, branches, grass, even what looked like part of an animal carcass. I sat beside the contaminated water and tried not to let despair overwhelm me completely. It was then, as I contemplated the ruins of my survival efforts, that I noticed the fresh vehicle tracks in the muddy ground where the storm runoff had pooled. The tracks were recent, made after the rain, while the ground was still soft. A four-wheel drive, probably a Toyota or similar, with good tread depth on tires that weren't bald, like those on my ute. The impressions were clean and sharp, made by someone who knew how to handle rough terrain. Someone had driven through here in the last few hours, close enough to my position that they might have seen my camp if they'd been looking. My pulse quickened as I studied the tracks more carefully. They led roughly southeast, toward what my mental map suggested might be higher ground. The spacing between the tracks suggested someone driving with purpose, not wandering or exploring. More importantly, they were clear enough to follow, at least until the sun baked the mud hard again. The decision felt monumental. Following the tracks meant abandoning my water source and the minimal shelter of the cattle yards. It meant gambling my remaining strength on the hope that the vehicle tracks would lead somewhere useful, another camp, a mine site, maybe even a way out of this empty country. But staying meant slow death by starvation and exposure. The storm had reset my survival clock, and I didn't have enough resources left to wait for rescue that might never come. I gathered what little remained of my gear, checking each item like a pilot running through a pre-flight checklist. The one good water container, 3/4 full. The damaged container, with perhaps a liter of muddy water. The dented tin of beans and a handful of crackers soft with moisture. My knife, still sharp despite everything I'd put it through. The clothes I wore and nothing else. Everything else was scattered across the landscape or destroyed. I filled both containers from the clearest part of the creek, settling for water that was cleaner than chocolate but far from clear. Then I set off following the tire tracks across country that seemed even more hostile than before. The tracks led me through increasingly rough terrain, over rocky ridges where the mud had dried quickly in the sun, and down into dry creek beds where the trail became harder to follow. My legs felt unsteady after days of minimal nutrition, and the fall and musam, draxnaquit, weight of the water containers seemed to increase with every step. I found myself reading sign like a detective, looking for disturbed stones and crushed vegetation where the visual track disappeared on harder ground. The sun climbed mercilessly overhead, and I had to stop frequently to rest in whatever shade I could find. Each rest stop felt like defeat, precious time and energy wasted, but pushing too hard would leave me collapsed beside the trail with no reserves left for recovery. I rationed my water carefully, allowing myself small sips that barely wet my mouth but had to serve until the next scheduled break. After 3 hours of walking in heat that felt like a physical weight pressing down from above, I crested a ridge and saw buildings in the distance. Not recent buildings, the corrugated iron was rust red, and the structures had the weathered look of abandonment that spoke of years, maybe decades, without maintenance. But buildings meant human presence, current or former, and the vehicle tracks led straight toward them. The mining camp had been deserted for years, maybe decades. I counted 4 main structures as I approached, what looked like an office building with its roof partially intact, 2 large sheds that might have housed equipment, and a smaller outbuilding that had the domestic look of living quarters. Solar panels glinted on one roof, some still intact, others cracked or missing entirely. The panels were old models, thick and heavy compared to modern installations, but their presence suggested the camp had been occupied relatively recently. The vehicle tracks led right up to the main building and then disappeared on the hard-packed earth of what had once been a cleared area. Whoever had made them had parked here, but whether they'd stayed or continued through was impossible to tell from the ground. I approached cautiously, my makeshift walking stick ready in case I encountered whoever had made those tracks. The office building's door hung open on rusted hinges, revealing an interior full of shadows and debris. Inside, I found signs of recent habitation that were both encouraging and deeply unsettling. Someone had been living here, but not in any organized way. Bedding was scattered in one corner, actual mattresses and blankets, luxury beyond my recent experience. The mattresses were stained and worn, but infinitely more comfortable than sleeping on bare ground. Canned goods were stacked along one wall, enough to represent serious wealth to a starving man. Beans, fruit, meat, even some vegetables in tins that looked military surplus. But other details troubled me. Words and symbols were carved into the wooden wall beside the sleeping area, some recognizable as English but forming sentences that made no sense. They watch the birds. One line read, "Count the days but not the nights. Water remembers everything." Numbers were scratched everywhere, some in obvious counting sequences, others in seemingly random patterns. And there was a smell, faint but persistent, of something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. I forced myself to ignore the strangeness and focus on immediate needs. The canned goods were a mixture of beans, fruit, and some kind of meat that looked like military rations from decades past. I opened a tin of peaches with my knife, the sweet syrup running down my chin as I ate. I forced myself to eat only half, saving the rest, despite my body's demands for more sugar and nutrition. The fruit tasted like salvation, each piece a burst of energy that made my vision clearer. A search of the other buildings yielded more supplies, tools, rope, even a battery-powered radio that might work if I could find fresh batteries. The radio was an old model, heavy and built for rough use, probably left behind when the mine closed, but everywhere I looked, I found more evidence of disturbed thinking. Elaborate diagrams drawn on walls in charcoal, and something that might have been blood, piles of rocks arranged in complex patterns that seemed meaningful, but incomprehensible, and what looked like animal bones arranged in ways that seemed deliberate, but meaningless. I was examining a hand-drawn map covered in symbols when I heard the vehicle. The engine sound came from the northeast, growing steadily closer. My first instinct was relief. Another person meant potential rescue, someone with transport who could help me reach civilization. But the evidence around me suggested that whoever lived here might not be entirely rational. I positioned myself in the doorway, where I could see the approaching vehicle but retreat quickly if necessary. The four-wheel drive that emerged from the scrub was an older model Toyota, red dust coating everything except the windshield. It pulled up beside the office building and sat there, engine running, for what felt like several minutes. I could see a figure behind the wheel, studying me with the same caution I was exercising. When the door finally opened, the man who emerged looked like he'd been living rough for months. His beard was gray and unkempt, his clothes patched and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. His movements carried the careful alertness of someone accustomed to being alone, each step deliberate and controlled. He was older than me, maybe 55, with skin burned dark by constant sun exposure and eyes that held too much intelligence for comfort. "G-Day," I called out, trying to keep my voice casual despite my hammering heart. "Hope you don't mind me sheltering here. Name's Jake." The man froze, his hand moving instinctively towards something at his belt. A knife, I realized, worn smooth by constant use. For a long moment we studied each other across the dusty clearing, two survivors taking each other's measure. "Bill," the man said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. "This is my camp." "Just passing through," I said quickly. "My ute broke down about 3 days, walk north of here. Been trying to find help." Bill's eyes were pale blue and intense, examining me with an attention that felt uncomfortably clinical. He was cataloging details, my condition, my gear, the way I held myself, with the focus of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on reading people correctly. 3 days north, that'd be past the old cattle station. "You know it? Know everything out here." Bill stepped closer, and I caught the smell of unwashed clothing and something else. A sharp, medicinal odor that reminded me of disinfectant. "Question is, what are you really doing here? Nobody just breaks down out here by accident." "Supply run to Kalgoorlie," I said, sticking to the truth. "Took a shortcut that turned out to be not so short." Bill laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was harsh, like metal scraping against stone. "Shortcut?" "Yeah, that's what they all say." "Shortcut to where, mate? Shortcut to what?" I felt the conversation sliding sideways into territory I didn't understand. Bill's intensity was increasing, his body language becoming more aggressive. Whatever isolation and harsh living had done to this man's mind, I was beginning to realize I might be dealing with someone genuinely unstable. But he was also someone who'd survived alone out here, which meant he possessed knowledge I desperately needed. "Look, I just need some help getting out of here," I said carefully. "Maybe a lift to the nearest town, or someone I can call for rescue. I can pay you." "Pay me?" Bill's laugh was sharper this time, edged with something that might have been hysteria. "With what? Government money? Company scrip? You think I'm stupid?" I raised my hands in a peaceful gesture, trying to project calm despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "I think you're someone who's been living out here long enough to know how hard it is. I'm just asking for help from one bloke to another." Bill stared at me for what felt like minutes, his pale eyes unblinking. Then, abruptly, his manner changed. The suspicion didn't disappear, but it shifted into something more calculating, more practical. "All right, Jake, maybe we can help each other out, but there's rules out here." "My rules? You don't touch my gear, you don't go through my things, and you don't ask too many questions about things that ain't your business. Clear?" I nodded quickly. "Clear." "Good. 'Cause the last bloke who came through here asking for help, he didn't follow the rules too well." Bill's smile was thin and unpleasant, revealing teeth stained with tea and worse things. Had to send him on his way pretty quick. I spent an uneasy night in the mining camp, sleeping in one of the other buildings while Bill remained in his claimed territory. The older man had shared some food, tinned meat and bread that tasted like luxury after my recent diet, but the conversation had remained stilted and strange. Bill talked in loops and tangents, jumping from practical observations about desert survival to elaborate theories about government, surveillance and mining company conspiracies. He seemed to know the country intimately, describing water sources and landmarks across hundreds of square kilometers. His knowledge was encyclopedic, the seasonal patterns of creeks, the locations of abandoned bores, the best routes between distant points. But his knowledge was filtered through paranoia that made me increasingly uncomfortable. He spoke of watches in aircraft, of tracking devices hidden in supply drops, of patterns in the behavior of wildlife that suggested human manipulation. Still, Bill represented my best chance of getting out alive. The man had a working vehicle, extensive supplies and knowledge of the terrain that I desperately needed. If I could maintain the uneasy peace between us, maybe I could convince him to help me reach civilization. The trick would be navigating his paranoia without triggering whatever violence lurked beneath his calculated friendliness. I woke before dawn to find Bill's vehicle gone. My first thought was relief. The tension of the previous evening had been almost unbearable, and part of me was glad to be alone again. But as I searched the camp more thoroughly, I realized Bill had taken more than just himself. My pack felt lighter when I lifted it, and a quick inventory revealed the theft. My spare water container was missing, along with the tin of peaches I'd been saving and my only decent knife. Bill had gone through my gear during the night, taking what he wanted like some kind of desert tax. The violation felt worse than the actual theft. I had trusted Bill enough to sleep in the same camp, and the man had repaid that trust by stealing supplies that could mean the difference between life and death. But he had also left things behind, some of the canned goods, tools that I could use, and most importantly, the vehicle tracks leading away from the camp. Fresh tracks that I could follow, at least for a while, deep impressions in the sandy soil that told a story of departure in the pre-dawn darkness. Bill had loaded his vehicle carefully, the tracks showing the deeper impression of added weight. He'd taken supplies, possibly everything portable, but he'd also left a trail that was readable even to my amateur tracking skills. I faced a decision that felt like a crossroads. I could stay at the mining camp, which offered shelter and some supplies but no real hope of rescue. The buildings would protect me from weather, and the remaining canned goods might stretch to weeks if I was careful. But weeks of what? Waiting for help that might never come, growing weaker until I lacked the strength to help myself? I could try to make my way back to my ute in the cattle yards, though that meant days of walking through country that had already nearly killed me. The storm had changed everything. Landmarks I'd learned to rely on were gone, and my careful preparations had been scattered or destroyed. Going back would mean starting over with even less than I'd had before, or I could follow Bill. The man was clearly unstable, possibly dangerous, but he knew this country and had resources I needed. If I could track him down and somehow convince him to help, it might be my last real chance of getting out alive. The risk was enormous. Bill had already shown he was willing to steal from me, and his paranoia might easily turn violent. But the alternative was slow death by exposure and starvation. I shouldered my depleted pack and set off following the tire tracks, walking deeper into empty country in pursuit of a man who might be my salvation or my doom. The tire tracks led me through increasingly broken country, winding between red stone outcrops and stands of mallee scrub that seemed to close in around me. The sun climbed mercilessly overhead, and I had to stop frequently to rest in whatever shade I could find. My water was running dangerously low again, and the weight of my pack seemed to increase with every step. Each rest stop became a negotiation between my body's demands for relief and my mind's knowledge that time was running out. By midday, the tracks had become harder to follow as Bill's vehicle had moved onto harder ground. The soft sand that had preserved clear impressions gave way to rocky soil, where only the occasional scuff mark or displaced stone marked his passage. I found myself guessing at the route, following the natural lie of the land, and hoping I was still on the right trail. The landscape had a timeless quality that made me feel like I was walking in circles, though my compass told me I was generally heading northeast. It was the smell of smoke that finally guided me in. A thin thread of it, barely detectable, drifting on the afternoon breeze. Wood smoke mixed with something else. Cooking food maybe, or just the general smell of human habitation. I changed course toward it, moving more carefully now, using the scrub as cover. I had no idea what kind of mood Bill might be in, and the man's paranoia made any approach potentially dangerous. He found the camp in a natural bowl surrounded by granite boulders, hidden so well that I nearly walked past it. Bill's vehicle was there, tucked under a tarp stretched between rocks, invisible from more than 20 meters away. A small fire burned in a ring of stones, with a billy can suspended over it on a wire tripod. The smell of cooking food made my empty stomach clench with hunger. And there was my water container, sitting bold as brass next to Bill's other gear. I crouched behind a boulder, studying the scene and trying to control my anger. Bill was nowhere to be seen, but the fire was fresh, and there were signs of recent activity. Gear spread out to air, clothes hung on a line stretched between rocks, the systematic organization of someone who planned to stay a while. My anger, which had been simmering all day, finally boiled over. The man had stolen from me, violated my trust, and now sat in comfort while I suffered. The unfairness of it made my vision blur with rage. I stood up and walked into the camp. "Bill," I called out, my voice harsh with exhaustion and fury. "I know you're here." Movement behind the rocks, quick and furtive. Bill emerged from what looked like a small cave, holding a rifle loosely in his hands. His eyes were wide and darting, and I could see immediately that the man's mental state had deteriorated even further. The paranoia I'd seen the night before had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. "I knew you'd come," Bill said, his voice high and strained. "Knew they'd send someone to track me. How long you been following me, eh? Days? Weeks?" "You stole from me," I said, pointing at my water container. "That's my gear." Bill laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your gear? Nothing belongs to anyone out here, mate. This is the old country, the real country. Take what you need, leave what you don't. That's the law." That water could have saved my life. Could have, might have, would have. Bill's grip tightened on the rifle, his knuckles white against the dark metal. "You're one of them, aren't you? Come to check up on old Bill, see what he's found out here. Well, I'm not telling you nothing." I took a step forward, and Bill raised the rifle. The barrel swung toward my chest with practiced ease, and I could see his finger move toward the trigger. "Don't," the man said. "I've killed before. Out in the desert, sometimes it's them or you." But I was beyond caring about the rifle. Weeks of hunger, thirst, and desperation had burned away my caution. I was tired of being afraid, tired of being a victim of circumstances and other people's madness. The sight of my stolen gear, the memory of waking to find myself robbed by the one person who could help me, it all crystallized into a fury that overwhelmed self-preservation. "Put it down, Bill," I said, taking another step. "I'm not whoever you think I am. I'm just trying to get home. That's what they all say." Bill's finger moved toward the trigger, but I was already moving. I dove to the side as the rifle cracked, the bullet whining off granite somewhere behind me. The sound echoed between the rocks, multiplied and amplified until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Before Bill could work the bolt, I was on him, tackling him around the waist and driving him backward into the rocks. We went down hard, the rifle spinning away across the sandy ground. Bill was stronger than I had expected, wiry and tough from months in the desert, his body hardened by constant physical demand. But I had desperation on my side, and the fury of a man who'd been pushed beyond his limits. We rolled and struggled, kicking up dust and scattering gear, both of us fighting with the intensity of men who knew only one of us would walk away. Bill got his hands around my throat, squeezing with surprising strength. His fingers dug into the sides of my neck, cutting off blood flow to my brain. My vision started to narrow, red spots dancing at the edges, like warning lights. I managed to get my knee up into Bill's ribs, feeling something give under the impact. The blow broke his grip, and I gasped for air as blood flow returned to my head. Before Bill could recover, I landed a solid punch to his jaw. My knuckles split against his teeth, but the blow snapped his head back against a rock with a sound that made my stomach turn. The man went limp, blood trickling from his scalp where it had struck the granite. For a horrible moment, I thought I'd killed him. Then Bill groaned and tried to sit up, his eyes unfocused but alive. I scrambled away, breathing hard and trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I could taste blood where I'd bitten my tongue during the fight. I looked at Bill, who was touching the back of his head gingerly, and felt a wave of revulsion at what I'd done. This was what I'd become, a man who fought over water containers and canned goods, who tackled injured people and punched them in the face. "Jesus," I whispered. "What are we doing?" Bill looked at me with something approaching clarity for the first time. Blood ran down his face from the scalp wound, but his eyes were focused and rational. "Trying to stay alive," he said simply. We sat in silence for a long time, both of us nursing our injuries and trying to understand what had just happened. I examined my split knuckles, flexing my fingers to make sure nothing was broken. My throat felt bruised where Bill had grabbed me, and swallowing was painful. Bill had a nasty cut on his scalp that would need attention, and he was moving like his ribs hurt where my knee had connected. Finally, Bill spoke. "You really trying to get home?" "Yeah." "Where's home?" "Port Hedland originally, but anywhere with people and a phone would do." Bill nodded slowly, as if processing this information through mental filters I couldn't understand. "I've been out here 8 months. Sometimes I forget what it's like around other people. Makes you crazy after a while." I looked around the camp, taking in the organization of it, the careful arrangement of supplies and shelter. Bill might be mad, but he'd survived out here longer than I'd thought possible. The camp was a masterpiece of desert living, water storage, food preservation, shelter from sun and wind. He'd adapted to this harsh country in ways that spoke of real intelligence beneath the paranoia. "You know the way out?" I asked. "Know lots of ways. Question is, do I want to go?" Over the following days we formed an uneasy partnership born of necessity. Bill's paranoia came and went in waves, but in his lucid moments, he proved to be an extraordinary bushman. He showed me how to read the subtle signs that indicated underground water, the deeper green of certain plants, the behavior of insects, the way morning dew collected differently on various surfaces. His knowledge was encyclopedic and practical, gained through months of trial and error in conditions that would have killed most people. He taught me how to construct deadfall traps for small game, using balanced rocks and trigger mechanisms that could catch rabbits or even small wallabies. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity, requiring no manufactured components, yet capable of providing protein that could mean the difference between survival and slow starvation. He showed me which plants could provide emergency nutrition, roots that could be roasted, leaves that could be chewed for moisture, seeds that could supplement our dwindling supplies of canned goods. I learned to recognize the warning signs when Bill's mental state was deteriorating, the way his eyes would start darting around, as if tracking invisible movement. How his speech would become rapid and fragmented, jumping between topics without logical connection. The way he would begin arranging objects in complex patterns that seemed meaningful to him but incomprehensible to me. During these episodes, I would simply wait it out, keeping my distance and avoiding anything that might trigger his paranoia. In return, I helped with the heavier work around camp and served as a stabilizing influence when Bill's grip on reality started to slip. I found that asking him to explain practical things, how to repair equipment or navigate by the stars, seemed to ground the man in the present. When he was teaching, demonstrating some aspect of desert survival, the paranoia would fade and he would become almost normal. It was as if having a student gave him a role that his damaged mind could accept. But Bill's behavior remained unpredictable. One morning I woke to find him talking animatedly to himself, carrying on both sides of a conversation with someone who wasn't there. He was discussing water rights and mining claims with his invisible companion, becoming increasingly agitated about perceived injustices. I waited until the episode passed, then helped him prepare breakfast as if nothing had happened. Another time Bill became convinced that our small campfire was sending signals to surveillance aircraft, and insisted we move immediately. He packed our gear with frantic efficiency, muttering about patterns in the smoke, and coded messages being transmitted to unknown watchers. We moved 5 kilometers before he was satisfied that we'd broken whatever surveillance net he imagined had located us. The worst incident came when we were following a dry creek bed that Bill claimed would lead to an old stock route. Bill had been quiet all morning, which I had learned was often more dangerous than his manic episodes. The silence meant he was thinking, processing information through mental filters that didn't always produce rational conclusions. We were picking our way across a section where the creek bed was choked with fallen timber when Bill suddenly stopped and spun around, his eyes wild. "You've been reporting back to them, haven't you?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Every night when you think I'm asleep." "Bill, there's nobody to report to out here." "Radio," Bill said, nodding toward my pack. "Hidden transmitter. I should have seen it before. My emergency beacon had died weeks ago, but I didn't think mentioning that would help. You can search my pack if you want, there's no radio." But Bill was already moving, grabbing my pack and dumping its contents across the ground. Canned goods scattered, my spare clothes unfolded in the dust, every personal possession exposed to his paranoid scrutiny. When he found nothing electronic except my broken GPS unit, his paranoia shifted focus with the fluid logic of mental illness. "Must be you then," he muttered, backing away from me. "They sent you. Made you look like you were in trouble, but you're one of them." He was reaching for the rifle when his foot caught on a piece of deadfall. Bill went down hard, his leg twisting underneath him as he fell. The crack of breaking bone was audible even over his scream, a sound that cut through the afternoon air like a gunshot. I rushed to help, but Bill tried to fight me off even as he writhed in agony. "Don't touch me! Don't you touch me! Bill, your leg's broken. Let me look at it." It took precious minutes to convince Bill to let me help, and when I finally got a look at the injury, my heart sank. The break was bad, a compound fracture of the tibia with the bone protruding through the skin. Blood soaked his pants leg, and I could see bone fragments in the wound. In civilization, it would require immediate surgery and months of recovery. Out here, it was potentially a death sentence. I did what I could with our limited medical supplies, cleaning the wound with precious water and fashioning a splint from deadfall and strips torn from my spare shirt. The bone needed to be set properly, but I lacked the knowledge and equipment to do it right. Bill had gone pale and quiet, whether from shock or pain I couldn't tell. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and his skin felt clammy when I checked his pulse. "We need to get you to a doctor," I said. Bill laughed bitterly, the sound weak, but still carrying its edge of hysteria. "Nearest doctor's 300 kilometers away. Might as well be on the moon." I looked at our situation with growing despair. Bill couldn't walk, and I couldn't carry him. The vehicle was here, but Bill had the keys and I wasn't sure I could find my way to civilization even with transport. More importantly, moving him might make the injury worse, possibly causing fatal blood loss or infection. But as I worked, cleaning the wound and adjusting the splint, I realized that Bill was teaching me even now. His approach to the injury, the way he directed me in cleaning the wound, the materials he suggested for the splint, showed a practical knowledge born of harsh experience. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before," I said. "You learned to patch yourself up out here, no choice." Bill's voice was weak but steady, the pain seeming to clear his mental confusion. "But this one's bad, real bad. We spent a terrible night in the creek bed, with me keeping a small fire going and Bill drifting in and out of consciousness. His fever started during the night, and I could feel the heat radiating from his skin when I checked his pulse. By morning, infection was already setting in, and Bill was running a high fever that left him delirious and talking to people from his past. He spoke to his mother, apologizing for things I couldn't understand. He argued with supervisors from mining jobs, relitigating grievances years old. Sometimes he would look at me with clear recognition, other times he seemed to see strangers or enemies. The sound of his suffering was almost unbearable, echoing off the creek banks in the pre-dawn darkness. I faced the hardest decision of my life. I could stay with Bill and probably watch him die, while likely dying myself when our supplies ran out. The infection was spreading, and I had no antibiotics or proper medical supplies to treat it. Or I could leave the injured man and try to reach help, though I had no guarantee I could find my way or that rescue would come in time. The mathematics of survival were brutal. 2 men staying here meant 2 men dying. 1 man leaving might mean 1 man surviving to bring help. But it also meant abandoning another human being to die alone in the desert, and the weight of that choice was almost unbearable. Bill made the decision for me during a brief lucid moment around midday. "You gotta go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This leg's finished me, and you know it. Take what you need from my pack and get moving. I'm not leaving you here to die." "You are, because it's the only smart thing to do." Bill's eyes were clear for the first time in days. The fever temporarily lifted enough to let him think rationally. I've been dead for months anyway, just too stubborn to lie down. But you still got a chance." I spent the afternoon agonizing over the decision, watching Bill slip back into delirium. He talked to people from his past, and sometimes cried out in pain, the sound echoing off the creek banks like the voice of the desert itself. The practical part of my mind understood that staying would accomplish nothing except adding my death to his. But the human part recoiled from the idea of abandoning another person to die alone. As evening approached, I finally accepted what I had to do. I gathered the best of our combined gear, taking only what I could carry without exhausting myself before reaching help. I left Bill with enough food and water to last several days, along with the rifle for protection or other purposes. I didn't want to think about that final use, but I understood why he might want the option. "I'll come back," I promised, though Bill was unconscious and couldn't hear me. "I'll bring help." I set off in the gathering darkness, following the creek bed toward what I hoped was the stock route Bill had mentioned. Behind me, the small fire I'd built cast dancing shadows on the rocks where Bill lay dying. I carried with me everything he had taught me about desert survival, along with the crushing weight of leaving another human being to die alone. The first night was the worst. I kept stopping to listen, half expecting to hear a rifle shot from behind me. The sound never came, but I found myself hoping for it, a clean ending that would spare Bill the slow agony of infection and fever. But there was only silence, and the vast indifference of the desert night, stars so bright they cast shadows on the ground I walked. I walked for 3 days, following the creek bed until it intersected with what looked like an old vehicle track. The track was overgrown and barely visible, but it showed signs of recent use, tire marks from Bill's vehicle or others like it. It led me up out of the creek system and onto higher ground where I could see for kilometers in every direction. The country stretched endlessly in all directions, but there were patterns in the landscape that suggested human presence somewhere ahead. On the morning of the 4th day since leaving Bill, I crested a low ridge and saw something that made my heart leap. A thin line of green vegetation that could only mean a permanent water source. And beyond that, the geometric shapes that meant human habitation. Buildings arranged in the ordered patterns that spoke of community and civilization. It was a small Aboriginal community, just a handful of houses clustered around what looked like a school and health clinic. Solar panels glinted on roofs, and I could see vehicles parked in the shade of trees. The sight of other humans, of structures built for comfort rather than mere survival, almost brought me to my knees. I stumbled down the ridge toward it, my legs barely able to carry me. People came out to meet me, kind faces speaking in voices that sounded like salvation. They gave me water and got me to the clinic, where a nurse cleaned my wounds and started me on a drip to combat dehydration. The community's radio operator contacted emergency services in Port Hedland, and I gave them the GPS coordinates for where I'd left Bill. The helicopter found Bill's body 2 days later. He'd been dead for at least 24 hours, probably from infection and blood loss. The rifle was still beside him, unfired. He'd chosen to endure the slow death rather than take the quick way out. I spent a week recovering in the Port Hedland hospital, answering questions from police and search and rescue personnel. The official report would say I'd survived 70 days in the desert through a combination of luck, determination, and the knowledge I'd gained from an experienced Bushman I'd encountered. They would list Bill as another casualty of the unforgiving country, a hermit who'd stayed out too long. But I knew the truth was more complicated than that. I'd learned things about survival that couldn't be found in any manual, about the delicate balance between civilization and wilderness, about what people were capable of when stripped down to their essential selves. I'd discovered reserves of strength and endurance I'd never known I possessed, but also a capacity for moral compromise that would haunt me for years. The desert had taught me that survival wasn't just about food and water and shelter. It was about holding on to your humanity when everything around you conspired to strip it away, about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. 3 months after my rescue, I sat in the air-conditioned comfort of my Perth office, staring at the geological surveys spread across my desk. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant electrical whisper that had once seemed normal, but now felt alien after 70 days of silence broken only by wind and wildlife. My colleagues moved past my glass-walled office with coffee cups and smartphones, their conversations about weekend plans and mortgage rates floating through the thin walls like transmissions from another world. The scars on my arms had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The 20 kilos I'd lost had mostly returned, thanks to my wife Sarah's determined cooking and my own rediscovered appetite for civilization's abundance. On paper, Jake Morrison had made a full recovery. The company had even given me a commendation for my survival, as if enduring 70 days of hell was some kind of achievement worthy of celebration. But I knew better. Recovery wasn't measured in weight gained or scars healed. It lived in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when the office's recycled air felt too thin and the walls pressed too close. It whispered in my dreams, where Bill's voice still carried across endless red earth, teaching me which plants would kill and which might keep me alive another day. The phone on my desk buzzed, a message from the mining operation up near Newman, asking for my expertise on a new site survey. Remote location, they said. 3 weeks minimum in the field. My finger hovered over the reply button, and for a moment I could taste dust on my tongue and feel the sun's weight pressing down on my shoulders like a physical thing. Still thinking about going back out there? Sarah's voice made me look up. She stood in my doorway, designer heels and tailored suit making her look like she belonged in this world of glass and steel and climate control. But her eyes held the worry that had lived there since the day I'd called from the hospital, voice cracked and strange, to tell her I was alive. "It's work," I said, closing the laptop. "Just work." "Is it?" Sarah stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. "Because you've been staring at that message for 20 minutes. I can see you from my desk." That was Sarah, observant, persistent, unwilling to let me hide behind easy answers. It was what had made her a good lawyer and a good wife, though I sometimes wondered if the man she'd married would have recognized the one who'd come back from the scrub. "They need someone who understands the country," I said. "Someone who won't get himself killed if things go wrong." "And you think that's you now?" Sarah sat in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where clients usually sat when they needed someone to find water in impossible places or assess the viability of mining operations in the back of beyond. "Jake, you almost died out there." "But I didn't." The words came out harder than I'd intended, carrying an edge that made Sarah flinch. I softened my voice, tried again. "I survived because I learned things, important things, about the country, about myself. About Bill." The name hung in the air between us like smoke. Sarah knew the official story, hermit prospector, accidental meeting, shared knowledge that had kept me alive. She knew about Bill's death, about the rescue, about the 70 days that had changed her husband in ways she was still trying to understand. But she didn't know about the rifle, about the moment when I had to choose between my own survival and another man's life. She didn't know about the weight that settled in my chest sometimes, especially in the small hours before dawn, when I wondered if I could have tried harder to convince Bill to come with me. "Bill saved my life," I said, which was true as far as it went. "He taught me things about the bush that kept me alive. And then he died." Sarah's voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of conversations we'd had, and conversations we'd avoided. "Jake, you carry guilt that isn't yours to carry. You couldn't have forced him to come with you." I nodded because that was what she needed to hear and because some part of me even believed it. But belief and knowledge were different things, and I knew with the certainty that came from 70 days in hell that I'd made choices out there that had shaped who lived and who died. The desert didn't deal in easy absolutions or comfortable lies. It had stripped away everything unnecessary and shown me what remained, and some of what remained was harder to live with than the hunger and thirst had been. I keep thinking about something he told me, I said. About how the country doesn't care about your plans, or your schedule, or your good intentions. It just is. And you either learn to work with it, or it kills you. That's not exactly a comforting philosophy. No, I agreed, but it's honest. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Is that what you're looking for out there? Honesty? The question caught me off guard, partly because it came so close to something I hadn't been able to articulate even to myself. The office felt suddenly stifling, its artificial climate and filtered air like a barrier between me and something essential I'd touched during those 70 days. I'd learned to read the country's moods in the color of the sky at dawn, to find water by following the flight patterns of birds, to judge my own condition by how far I could walk without rest. That knowledge felt important in a way that geological surveys and mining reports never could, and every day spent in air conditioning felt like forgetting something I couldn't afford to lose. I think, I said slowly, I'm looking for a way to live with what I learned out there, about myself, about what people are capable of when everything else gets stripped away. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the intensity she usually reserved for difficult cases. And you think you'll find that in the middle of nowhere? I know I won't find it in here. I gestured at the office, the city visible through my window, the whole comfortable cage of civilization that had once felt like home. Out there, things matter in ways they don't in here. Water matters, shelter matters. Whether you help someone or leave them behind, that matters in ways it doesn't, when everyone's safe and fed and surrounded by rules that keep the hard choices at arm's length. Those rules exist for good reasons, Jake. They're what separate us from what? From the truth about what we really are? I stood up, restless energy driving me to pace to the window. Perth stretched out below me, a million people living their lives in the faith that water would always flow from taps, and food would always fill supermarket shelves and help would always come when they called for it. I lived without those rules for 70 days. I found out what I was really made of, and I'm not sure I can just pretend that doesn't matter anymore. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, professional, the tone she used when she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Are you saying you want to go back to living like that? No. The answer came without hesitation, because I had no romantic illusions about what those 70 days had been. They'd been hell, pure and simple, hunger and thirst and fear, and the constant possibility of death lurking just beyond the next ridge. But they'd also been real in a way that nothing in my current life felt real. I'm saying I want to find a way to live with both versions of myself. The one who belongs in air conditioning and the one who can survive when everything goes wrong. And you think taking another job in the middle of nowhere is the answer? I turned from the window to look at my wife, really look at her. Sarah represented everything good about civilization, compassion, intelligence, the kind of moral complexity that let people live together in something approaching harmony. She was what I'd been trying to get back to during those 70 days. The reason I'd kept walking, when every step felt like it might be my last. But she'd never had to choose between her own survival and someone else's life. She'd never had to decide whether to share the last of her water with a dying man, or save it for herself. She'd never had to live with the knowledge that survival sometimes required a kind of brutal honesty about what you were willing to sacrifice to stay alive. I think, I said, I need to find out whether I can do the work without losing myself in it again. Whether I can go back to the country as the person I am now, instead of the person I was when I first broke down. Sarah nodded slowly, though I could see the fear in her eyes. And if you can't? It was the question I had been avoiding, the one that woke me in the small hours when Perth's streetlights couldn't quite banish the memory of stars so bright they cast shadows on the desert floor. What if the man who'd survived 70 days in hell couldn't live in air conditioning? What if the knowledge Bill had given me, about survival, about the country, about the thin line between civilization and wilderness, came with a price I was still learning to pay? Then I'll figure that out too, I said, but I can't do it sitting in this office, pretending those 70 days didn't happen. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city she'd called home her entire life. You know I can't go with you on this one. Not just physically, I mean I can't understand it the way you need me to. I know, but I'll be here when you get back, however many times it takes. I felt something tight in my chest loosen slightly. Sarah couldn't follow me into the country that had shaped me, but she could offer me something almost as valuable, a place to return to, a reminder of who I'd been before and who I might choose to be again. The job's only 3 weeks, I said. This job is 3 weeks, but this isn't really about one job, is it? No, I realized, it wasn't. It was about finding a way to honor what Bill had taught me, not just the practical knowledge that had kept me alive, but the harder lessons about what survival really meant. It was about carrying forward the voices of the empty places, without letting them drown out everything else that mattered. I opened my laptop and started typing a response to the mining company. I would take the job, but on my terms this time. Better equipment, better communication, better planning. I would go back to the country, not as someone running toward or away from anything, but as someone who'd learned to respect both its dangers and its teachings. As I typed, I could almost hear Bill's voice carried on the officer's artificial breeze. Country doesn't care about your plans, mate. But it'll teach you things about yourself you never knew you needed to learn. The desert had let me go, but it hadn't released me. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps the real lesson of those 70 days wasn't about surviving in impossible conditions, but about learning to carry impossible knowledge without letting it destroy everything good that remained. About finding a way to be both the man who could endure hell and the man who chose to return home. I hit send on the email and leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of a city going about its business. Tomorrow I would start preparing for another journey into the country that had remade me. But tonight, I would go home to Sarah and the life I'd fought so hard to return to, carrying with me the knowledge that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about staying human. If you've ever driven the long road at night, you know the silence. Hit like and subscribe. More stories are coming.